Hi, this is Andy Hoffman, Marketing Director of Miles Franklin Precious Metals, in our 26th year in business. It's Saturday morning, July 18th, 2015, and the title of this week's second audio blog is Providing Reason in a World of Lies, Propaganda, and Stupidity. Well, it is early Saturday morning, as in 5 o'clock a.m. early, and care of the most vicious, world-destroying manipulation of financial markets, economic data, and most importantly, common sense, my sleepless life continues. Not because I'm not exhausted, which frankly I've never been more so, but because, like Andy Schectman and David Schectman, I feel a personal burden, responsibility, and passion to help listeners through yet another period of extreme, in many cases maximum stress. Having been fully invested in the sector for 13 years, in the past 7 years, professionally as well as financially, I have been through as much such stress as anyone on the planet. Only this time, since 2011 that is, I sleep the sleep of the just because I no longer own mining shares, closed-end funds, or any of the other paper PM investments disguising as the means to protect oneself from the cataclysmic financial collapse that is not only coming, but has already started in earnest, particularly for the billions worldwide that do not count the violently abused reserve currency that is the US dollar as their own. Here at Miles Franklin, we are amidst our best month since the cartel paper raids of April 2013. Only this time, there is little opportunism about what our clients are doing. In other words, after years of relative lethargy, the result of an historic stock and bond bubble, unprecedented propaganda regarding a recovery that was always just around the corner, and generally speaking, the time immemorial human traits of hope and denial, precious metal buying here in the States and much of the Western world has been highly subdued, in contrast to the record buying in China, India, and most of the Eastern world. Today, however, as Andy Schectman told me yesterday morning, our clients are experiencing a fear not seen since the heart of the 2008 crisis. Only this time, the global economic situation is dramatically worse, as well as the cumulative financial situation and future outlook. Frankly, I doubt if things have appeared this bleak since the early 1930s. Only this time, the world is engorged in hundreds of trillions worth of parabolically increasing debt, with industrial capacity dramatically more oversupplied, care of decades of central bank-induced malinvestment, and of course, all-out currency collapses as the final stage of history's most virulent, cancerous fiat Ponzi scheme plays through its final destructive act. And yet, ironically, the world's 1% have never been richer, as said central banks, which in large part they control, have blown up the largest financial asset bubble in history, far larger than 1929, 1987, 2000, and 2007 combined. And that includes the two sociopaths most representative of the calamity wrought upon the world's billions of denizens, in my view, i.e., JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon and Goldman Sachs' Lance Blankfein. You know, the man who claims to be doing God's work, who this year have both become billionaires. Congratulations, Jamie and Lloyd. I mean, think about it. How many people do you know that actually speak of the NASDAQ breaking its 2000 internet mania highs each day, as opposed to in 2000, when everyone you knew, yourself included, not only spoke of it, but were heavily invested? You know, when the global economy peaked for generations to come, global prosperity, even if artificial by nature, was as broad as it was powerful, and the outlook for our children's future never stronger. Heck, that was when the euro was launched, with hundreds of millions of Europeans as bullish about the so-called union as its leaders had created as they are bearish about it today. To think that back in 2000, Greece, for example, had just 150 billion euros of debt or so, compared to what will likely be closer to 500 billion when its third bailout in 5 years is finalized, including a 50 billion euro, quote, asset liquidation fund, is simply incredible. And whilst Greece is currently getting all the attention, it sadly is just a pimple on the arse of a world awash with debt, as per Zero Hedge, far larger nations, including the United States, are in equally devastating financial positions, with nowhere to go but down. As for this week's news and markets, it started out with, as described in Thursday's audio blog, the stench of failure, actions by Greece's supposed leader Alexis Tsipras in selling his people out via actions beyond contempt and beyond mere portrayal. To wit, just 2 days after having passionately pled for the Greek population to vote against heightened austerity, precisely what he was voted in office to end, but he contradicted the voice of 61% of the people by not only agreeing to be bailed out by the very troika that has all but destroyed Greece, but with a far more onerous agreement, including said €50 billion asset liquidation fund, holding Greek islands, airports, and infrastructure, for instance, as collateral against the inevitable default of its now €450 billion or so of debt and counting. Incredibly, an astounding 78% of Greece's parliament, including most of Syriza, ratified the new €86 billion bailout monstrosity, as well as the rest of Europe's leaders, led by Germany's wicked sociopath Angela Merkel, who claimed Europe would be, quote, grossly negligent to not at least attempt such a bailout. Yes, grossly negligent to not attempt, like the €110 billion bailout number 1 in 2010, the €130 billion bailout number 2 in 2012, and all the other miserably failed bailouts of Greece and every other sovereignty, municipality, corporation, and otherwise, since history's largest fiat Ponzi scheme permanently broke in 2008. As for the bailout itself, I'm still not sure it actually exists. To wit, despite the aforementioned ratification, not only are Greece's banks and likely stock market still not opening on Monday, but the stock of what I have for years deemed the world's most important, i.e. the Bank of Greece, not only saw all of Monday's post-bailout gains erased, but saw its U.S. traded ADR close the week below $1 per share, i.e. just a fraction from its all-time low. To wit, despite the so-called bailout, all the Troika actually agreed to release is just enough capital, produced of course, fresh from the ECB's printing press, to pay itself back, with not even enough additional capital to keep the banks open, or staunch what will likely be an acceleration of the ongoing bank run. In other words, it's difficult to see what, if anything, was actually bailed out except the Troika itself. And that barely so, given the unending amount of interest and principal payments Greece owes it, not just for the foreseeable future, but forever. Which is why said bailout is not only doomed to failure from the start, in essence guaranteeing a Grexit more than ever before, but frankly is difficult to even identify. Okay, on to the next horrific topic, which frankly I have numerous to choose from just this week alone. However, none more ominous than the global commodity collapse I first warned of in January's Direst Prediction of All article, and followed up with this week's Direst Prediction of All Part 2, Mining Armageddon. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that, by far, the largest, most important global industry is commodities production and sale. And with the CRB Commodity Index closing yesterday just 2% above its early 2009 spike bottom low, and 6% above 40-year lows, and this following laughably blatant oil PPT intervention at the psychologically important $50 per barrel level for WTI crude, one can see just how close the global economy is to its next all-out collapse, which, unlike 2008, will decidedly not be savable with new rounds of central bank money printing, which more likely than not will only exacerbate what is already a full-blown currency crisis, as exemplified by the average currency closing yesterday at or near multi-year, and in many cases multi-decade lows. And this goes particularly for the myriad commodity currencies of the world, i.e. those of countries whose primary economic drivers are the aforementioned sale of domestically produced commodities, such as, for instance, Canada, which just Thursday morning, in an emergency central bank meeting, not only dramatically reduced its 2015 GDP expectation to negative territory, but unexpectedly reduced interest rates to barely above zero. And this before WTI crude plunged in the ensuing 36 hours from $53.50 per barrel to nearly $50 per barrel. And by the way, look no further than Barack Obama himself for the latest commodity-killing impetus, who, in a fit of blind megalomania, reversed 100 degrees his anti-Iran rhetoric by aggressively pursuing, and this week accomplishing, a so-called peace agreement that, while unlikely to make the world even the slightest bit more peaceful, will certainly cause it to be swamped in unneeded crude oil for years to come. To wit, oil prices have plunged by roughly 20% in the weeks leading up to this week's agreement, and now, just days after its completion, we've learned that Iran has secretly stored perhaps 50 or more million barrels of oil offshore, which likely will accelerate the timing of the hideous glut now guaranteed by said deal. Not that I have an issue with Iran selling its oil, mind you, as I only bring this up to highlight how, despite oil prices being near multi-year lows before the agreement was reached, the proverbial worst has yet to come. And sadly, crude oil, which by far is the most important commodity regarding the world's ability to fund itself and stave off corporate, municipal, and sovereign bankruptcy, is representative of the gross oversupply witnessed in nearly all global commodities, from Dr. Copper to lumber to essentially everything else. Except, of course, the food items being affected by historic droughts in major food-producing regions like California and Brazil. And oh yeah, gold and silver, care of the horrific supply collapse inadvertently caused by 15 years of illegal, surreptitious price suppression. I'll get to that in a second, particularly as it is the topic most listeners are likely most interested in hearing about. But first, let's discuss the United States of fraudulent recovery, as highlighted in spades by Whirlybird Janet's incredibly dovish statements at Tuesday and Wednesday's semi-annual Humphrey Hawkins Congressional Economic Testimony. In Wednesday's article and Thursday's audio blog, I went into great detail, not just of how blindly dovish she was, but the utterly pathetic attempts of the Fed's paid propagandists, John Hilsenrath of the Wall Street Journal and Steve Leeson of CNBC, to paint her pleadings otherwise. And thus, I'm not going to rehash them here. That said, I'll repeat this week's economic data miseries, if simply to highlight just how ridiculous it is for anyone to believe the Fed is considering tighter monetary policy, particularly with the dollar now exploding higher due to the liquidity vacuum I predicted 2 years ago as the world plunges headlong into its worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. To wit, I've already discussed Tuesday's horrific, unexpectedly negative retail sales and catastrophic plunge in NFIB business sentiment, as well as the deflationary plunge in import and export prices toward 2008's spike bottom lows, as well as Wednesday's free-falling industrial production to its lowest year-over-year growth rate in 5.5 years, an 8% weekly plunge in mortgage purchase applications. And of course, Thursday's unexpected collapse in the Philly Fed Index, and news that Chinese selling of U.S. Treasuries utterly exploded in the past 3 months, begging the question, yet again, of who the heck has been buying them now that QE3 is supposedly over. To that end, let's just say that if you read my October 2014 article, The End of QE, LOL, announced just after the Fed pretended to stop monetizing treasuries, I think you'll get the idea who has been buying them now. Again, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out. As per my December 2013 article, Proof of the Tapering Mirage, the Fed is as adept at hiding its tracks as in forecasting economic activity, which is to say, not at all. As for Friday, the economic coup de grace for the week was the utter implosion of consumer sentiment, which unexpectedly collapsed from 96 to 93 despite exploding stock markets, the Greek bailout, Iranian peace agreement, Fed hawkishness, and all manner of, per the title of today's audio blog, lies, propaganda, and stupidity. Throw in the fact that the supposed surge in housing starts, assuming it's even a real statistic, was not only the result of yet another dubious explosion higher in a single region in the Northeast, but was entirely due not to residential housing, but rental properties. And this on a day when lumber prices plunged anew. And you could see just how obvious it is that whatever economic statistics are still shown to be, quote, recovering are either mistruths, errors, or flat-out lies. And if indeed rental housing is indeed on the verge of a major increase, which makes sense given that U.S. rents, despite the horrific expanding recession, are at all-time highs, it only underscores just how vulnerable residential house prices are, particularly with interest rates at all-time lows with nowhere to go but up. And as for the ultimate economic data, look no further than the aforementioned commodity and currency collapses if you want to know how the U.S. and global economy is really doing. Or heck, Friday's survey of the 6-month outlook of worldwide McDonald's franchisees, which hit an all-time low. Not to mention fresh evidence of the utter implosion of the historically oversupplied, over-channel stuffed auto industries ongoing, in Ford now offering incredible $10,000 discounts on plain old F-150 pickup trucks. And speaking of economic collapse, let's go back to China, which this week reported, quote, better than expected second quarter GDP growth of 7%, despite not just for months, but years, all other economic data pointing not just to subpar growth, but outright contraction. Finally, said growth is being attacked not just by alternative media like the Miles Franklin blog, but the mainstream itself for the fraud that it is. To the point that this week, the usually reserved Chinese press, owned entirely by its government, sounded a bit like Lady Macbeth in its pathetic pleas to be believed. I mean, if the Chinese economy were doing so well, how could commodity and housing prices be plunging while its debt explodes and, oh yeah, its PBOC-fueled historic equity bubble implodes? To that end, even the PBOC hasn't been bashful in showing just how much it's printed and spent in recent weeks to prop up its collapsing stock market, to the point that, like its neighbor in Japan, it's become crystal clear that the Shanghai Exchange has become as freely traded as the Nikkei, which is overtly supported by the Bank of Japan. And now that the dollar-pegged yuan is rocketing higher against the currencies of the yen, euro, and essentially all others, it's just a matter of time before the PBOC is forced to consider what I have long suggested will be the financial Big Bang to end all Big Bangs, i.e. depegging the yuan to protect China's eroding manufacturing market share, which, when it occurs, will be the most deflationary event in global history, forcing the final currency war I warned of 2.5 years ago, which is ongoing in earnest as we speak, to go nuclear, which of course will rocket already record-high physical gold and silver demand into the stratosphere. Which brings me to my next topic, i.e. yesterday morning's long-awaited announcement by the PBOC of an update to China's supposed gold reserves. As most listeners know, they hadn't been updated in 6 years, when in April 2009 they were increased from 600 tons to a still comically understated 1,054 tons. For the past 6 months or so, speculation has been rampant, particularly amidst a precious metal community desperate for an upside catalyst, that China would increase this amount by many multiples, perhaps in concert with this October's IMF Global Currency Rebalancing meetings. To the contrary, I was one of the lone wolves in stating otherwise per May's article titled, "When Will We Learn of China's Massive Gold Hoard?" In it, I claimed that such a dramatic announcement would not only shake up an already fragile global monetary system, but have cataclysmic near-term effects on an already imploding Chinese economy, even if the long-term benefits would be enormous. Quote, "Nothing occurs in a vacuum, and certainly not world-changing events like, for instance, depegging the yuan from the dollar, or announcing an official or unofficial gold backing, to the tune of 5,000, 10,000, or perhaps vastly more tons. When such knowledge becomes public, either purposefully or by accident, it is highly unlikely to be part of a grand Chinese plan, in my view, as such an announcement will have such broad cataclysmic political, economic, and social ramifications, there's essentially no chance the current government would survive it. Governments, after all, care 99.9% about maintaining their power and 0.1% about all else. To that end, I put the odds of the Chinese government, unprompted and uncatalyzed, simply coming out and saying, yeah, we have 20,000 tons, at about the same level as the CFTC coming out and saying, yeah, gold and silver are illegally suppressed by JP Morgan. Instead, I believe a more likely scenario is that the next major financial crisis, likely the big one that destroys the world's largest fiat Ponzi scheme, forces the Chinese to defend themselves and their crashing currency by announcing their massive gold reserves. Perhaps this may actually be somewhat planned if an exploding dollar, due to a global fear-based flight to liquidity, forces the PBOC to depeg the yuan. If this occurs, the most likely market reaction would be a plunging yuan, which in turn could force the PBOC to slow the yuan's descent by announcing its massive gold reserves. Either way, the global ramifications of such an announcement would be so powerfully negative, the Chinese economy, already on death's door, would be dramatically weakened as well, and thus you can see why such a scenario is decidedly not desired by the Chinese government. And again, I wrote this in May. And thus, it was not surprising that when the big announcement did finally come, in last night's wee hours, or Thursday night's wee hours, it was of a measly increase from 2009's 1,054 tons to the equally comical, precise number of 1,658 tons, representing an increase of 57%. From my perspective, such an announcement couldn't be more bullish in that, particularly with its current stock market and economic woes, the Chinese government believed it wise to advise the world it is acquiring gold, particularly given the associated verbiage it published that, quote, Gold is a special asset with both financial and commodities attributes that, together with other assets, help to regulate and optimize the overall risk-return characteristics of international reserve portfolios. Mathematically, of course, the concept of Chinese gold reserves being increased by just 604 tons in 6 years is ridiculous, particularly in light of the fact that China has produced more than 2,500 tons itself from its mines during this period, with not a single ounce allowed to leave the country. Not to mention the record gold imports that have been since reported, including roughly 600 tons in the first half of 2015 alone, which don't even include undisclosed imports at the new Beijing and Shanghai free trading zones, or record gold deliveries from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. In other words, according to Andrew McGuire, yesterday's published numbers were bullshit, which he expounded upon by stating exactly what I have been saying all along, i.e., why would the Chinese show their hand? This announcement that they are only holding 1,658 tons of gold is ludicrous. Read the book The Art of War. They have accumulated thousands of tons of gold since 2009. As further expounded by the equally sage and gold bullish words of Zero Hedge, quote, now that the seal has finally been broken after so many years, we expect the PBOC to start leaking incremental gold holding data every month, and especially in months when the market crashes, which will bring us ever closer to what China's true gold holdings are. Frankly, I have a difficult time believing yesterday's announcement suggests a new monthly policy. However, it is not out of the question, and per what I've said all along of China's desire for the yuan to one day be the new reserve currency, it's entirely possible Zero Hedge is right. And even if not, I have no doubt that, in time, it will be made widely known that China's gold reserves are dramatically higher than 1,658 tons, perhaps under the right circumstances, far sooner than most can imagine. Which brings me to the so-called market reaction, with no better description of the mainstream's idiocy, again highlighting today's audio blog title, than the randomly chosen stupidity of a so-called analyst named Bernard Dada, who moronicsally claimed the reserve figures were, quote, disappointing as China isn't adding gold as much as people thought it was, which on the surface sounds intelligent enough until you hear his follow-up comment that, quote, it begs the question of what's been happening to the gold produced that hasn't been taken by the central bank. To which I can only beg the question of what kind of analyst can't do the same simple math I highlighted above, proving the Chinese government, as in GDP, human rights progress, shadow banking leverage, and essentially all else, is lying. That said, in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, as is usually the case in today's derivatives-controlled age, per last week's revelation that Citigroup alone added $50 billion of precious metal derivatives in the first quarter alone, gold prices didn't budge. That is, until, for the third straight day, the second the New York COMEX opened, when, as Zero Hedge described them, someone suddenly launched a market order for an obscene $1.4 billion of sales of paper gold. As you can imagine, 2% of the entire annual worldwide production of gold yielded but another waterfall decline, not just of gold, but silver, which not only is heavily oversold to start with, but is currently amidst a massive physical shortage, as evidenced by the U.S. Mint still being sold out of silver eagles, and silver premiums and delivery times still significantly above average. As for financial markets, whilst Google, simply by claiming it intended to increase its attention to cost reduction, added more market cap yesterday, as in $55 billion, than the entire market cap of 415 of the S&P 500 companies, taking the bubblicious NASDAQ to an all-time high, whilst commodities, currencies, and even U.S. interest rates plunged. The mining share annihilation I have vehemently, passionately warned of for more than 4 years also accelerated to 2008-like proportions. In other words, reflecting what I have screamed of all along, i.e., that prices are so far below the cost of production and mining assets so heavily overvalued that it is not on balance sheets that not only is it guaranteed that gold and silver production has peaked, perhaps permanently, but that the all-out implosion of the precious metal mining sector, just like the unprecedentedly leveraged U.S. shale oil industry, is mere months away, if not sooner. For those like myself that have wisely sold paper PM investments in lieu of real physical metal, have no fear. You will continue to sleep the sleep of the just. particularly those holding silver who have seen the premiums on their physical holdings surge, offsetting much of the month's cartel-induced paper losses. However, for those still holding significant amounts of mining shares, I can only sympathize, or should I say empathize, given I went through exactly what you are going through now. Not just owning mining shares during 2007 when the TSX venture peaked through 2011, but working in the mining industry from 2006 through 2011 when I joined Miles Franklin. Only this time around, unlike 2009 and 10, there will be no salvation, as the junior mining industry is already dead, and many of the majors, barring an unprecedented explosion of prices in the very near term, are on the cusp of dramatic write-offs that will put many, including some of the world's largest miners, into bankruptcy, and the lucky ones into draconian mergers which will ultimately buy them a bit more time while diluting existing shareholders into oblivion. Yesterday alone, most of the majors plunged by 5 to 10%, including the world's largest gold miner, Barrick, or as I deemed it 2 years ago, evil personified, which after breaking below $10 a share for the first time in 24 years on Tuesday, plunged to a closing low Friday of $8.79 per share, 83% below its November 2011 high. Given the current plunge in gold and silver prices, it's all but guaranteed that its goal of reducing its horrific, hubristically created $13 billion debt load is impossible, putting its own solvency at risk. As is the case for the entire South African gold industry, in cost terms the equivalent of U.S. shale, as well as dozens of household mining names from the four corners of the planet. And now that base metal prices are free-falling as well, it's just a matter of time before silver supply not only peaks, but free falls, given that 2/3 of all silver production emanates as byproduct from other mine types, particularly copper, lead, and zinc. Well, that's enough for now, which hopefully will provide enough reason in a world of lies, propaganda, and stupidity to not only empower you, but provide the basis for sound investment decisions as we rapidly approach the endgame of global currency collapse. Which, by the way, will be supplemented in spades if you watch Brent Johnson of Santiago Capital's newest 10-minute video masterpiece titled Count Your Blessings. To that end, we can only reiterate as vehemently as possible that the time is now to protect yourself while you still can. Here at Miles Franklin, we have conducted business for 26 years without a single registered complaint and can help you not only with the purchase, sale, or storage of precious metals, but a variety of financial planning strategies we have honed over 2 decades of working with gold and silver. In fact, not only did I tape a podcast with Miles Franklin's president and co-founder Andy Scheckman earlier this year to describe such strategies titled Swaps, Trades, and Repatriations, which you can find on our website or Google, but last week taped State of the Bullion Industry, in which Andy speaks of matters investors must be aware of in this current volatile environment. As for Miles Franklin, all we ask is that you give us a call at 800-822-8080 and allow our staff of professionals, on average sporting nearly 25 years of industry experience, to give you a free consultation. And as always, I can be reached via email at ahoffman@milesfranklin.com. And one final point, as I just finished my taping, it turns out the Greek banks will in fact open on Monday, but with capital controls. Wow, what great news. Talk to you soon.